January 1949. Outside a church in Rome, thousands of people gather, climbing walls and pressing against barriers just to catch a glimpse of a woman in a white wedding gown. Cameras flash, voices rise, and the moment feels larger than life. Beside her stands one of the most recognizable film stars in the world. The images from that day will travel across continents, printed in newspapers and magazines, turning the scene into something almost mythological. And yet, for all the attention, the woman at the center of it, Linda Christian, is someone whose story has slowly faded from public memory, which is exactly why it deserves to be told. Because her life was never just about that wedding, or the man beside her. It was a life shaped by movement, ambition, reinvention, and a constant search for belonging. A life that began far from the glamour of Rome or Hollywood, in a place few would expect. She was born Blanca Rosa Welter on November 13th, 1923, in Tampico, Mexico, a booming oil town in the early 20th century. Her father was a Dutch executive working in the oil industry, her mother German. From the very beginning, she existed between worlds. She wasn't fully claimed by any one country, any one culture. That sense of not quite belonging anywhere would follow her throughout her life, shaping both her identity and her choices. Her childhood was anything but stable. Her father's work required constant relocation, and as a result, she grew up moving from one country to another, South Africa, Palestine, Switzerland. By the time she was a teenager, she had experienced more of the world than most people ever would. She learned languages quickly, adapting to new environments with ease. Spanish, English, German, French, Italian. She spoke them all, not just as tools, but as keys that allowed her to enter different worlds. But there is a certain cost to that kind of upbringing. When you belong everywhere, you also belong nowhere. And for Linda, that translated into a quiet determination to build something of her own, something that would anchor her identity in a way her childhood never had. By the early 1940s, as the world was engulfed in war, she was living in Mexico City. It was there that the idea of acting began to take shape, not just as a dream, but as a direction. She had the kind of presence that drew attention without effort. People noticed her. Cameras responded to her. There was something in the way she carried herself that suggested she understood, instinctively, how to exist in front of an audience. So she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She left for Los Angeles. She did not arrive with connections or financial backing. There was no safety net waiting for her, no carefully planned entry into the film industry. What she had instead was confidence, real, unshakable confidence, and the ability to adapt. She found work where she could, taking small roles, appearing as an extra, accepting Spanish language parts that others overlooked. None of it was glamorous. None of it guaranteed anything. But she understood something important. Visibility mattered. Being seen mattered. Every small role, every appearance, every introduction was a step closer to something bigger. At some point during those early years, she managed to do what many aspiring actors never could. She got herself in front of one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood. It wasn't luck alone. It was timing, presence, and the ability to make an impression quickly. And she did, enough to be offered a contract. With that contract came a transformation. Blanca Rosa Welter became Linda Christian. The name was deliberate, simple, memorable, marketable. It fit the world she was entering, even if it left parts of her past behind. Being signed to a major studio in the 1940s was no small achievement, especially for someone who had arrived with so little. It meant access, opportunity, and a certain level of recognition. She appeared in films, took on roles that kept her visible, and slowly built a place for herself within the industry. But something about her career never fully aligned with the expectations that had been set. The roles were there, but not the defining ones. The visibility was there, but not the lasting breakthrough. She existed in that in-between space, known, but not fully established, present, but not central. And so her fame began to take shape in a different way. She became a figure people talked about, someone who appeared in magazines not just for her work, but for her presence, at events, at parties, in photographs that captured a kind of effortless elegance. She moved easily through social spaces, comfortable among influential people, adapting once again to a world that required both confidence and awareness. In many ways, this was where her earlier life prepared her best. The constant movement, the exposure to different cultures, the ability to read a room and adjust, these were not just childhood experiences anymore. They were tools, and she used them well. Still, there was an underlying sense that something was about to change, that the life she was building, carefully, persistently, was moving toward a moment that would define everything that came after. And that moment arrived not through a film role, but through a meeting. It happened at a party in Hollywood sometime in the mid-1940s. A setting that might have seemed ordinary at the time. People gathered, conversations overlapping, the quiet negotiation of attention and status that defined that world. But for Linda, it marked the beginning of something that would transform her life in ways she could not have anticipated. The man she met there was already a star, not just successful, but widely recognized, admired, and followed. Someone whose presence carried weight far beyond the room they stood in. What began between them was not casual. It was immediate, intense, and, in many ways, inevitable. Two people who understood visibility, who understood performance, not just on screen, but in life, drawn together in a way that would soon become impossible to separate from public attention. Within a short time, their relationship moved from private to public, from personal to something that belonged, in part, to the world watching them. And as their connection deepened, it became clear that this was not just another chapter in her life. It was the beginning of the chapter that would define her. By the time Linda Christian and Tyrone Power stepped into the public eye as a couple, the world was already watching closely. Power was not just a successful actor. He was one of the most admired faces of his generation. His films had reached audiences across continents, and his image carried a kind of quiet authority that had only deepened after his service in World War II. He returned to Hollywood not just as a star, but as a man shaped by experience, something audiences seemed to recognize instantly. For Linda, the relationship marked a shift. Until then, she had been building her presence carefully, piece by piece. Now, suddenly, she was part of something much larger, something that extended far beyond film sets and studio contracts. Their connection was real, by most accounts sincere and deeply felt, but it also unfolded in a space where private emotion and public fascination were impossible to separate. They moved quickly. Within a relatively short time, they were engaged. And from the moment the engagement became public, anticipation began to build. This was not just another Hollywood romance. It was something that carried an almost cinematic scale even before the wedding itself had taken place. When the day finally came, January 27th, 1949, the setting alone made it extraordinary. The ceremony was held at the church of Santa Francesca Romana in Rome, a place steeped in history, surrounded by the ruins of an ancient world that had witnessed centuries of spectacle. But even Rome, a city accustomed to grandeur, had rarely seen anything quite like what unfolded that day. Crowds gathered early, filling the streets, climbing onto ledges and ruins, pressing against barriers. It was not simply curiosity. It was something closer to collective excitement, the sense that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered. Police struggled to maintain order as thousands of people pushed forward, hoping for even a brief glimpse. Inside, the atmosphere was no less remarkable. The guest list read like a map of influence: diplomats, filmmakers, to members of European nobility, figures who moved within the highest social circles of the post-war world. It was a convergence of power, culture, and celebrity, all drawn into a single moment. Linda's appearance became part of the story itself. Her gown, designed by the renowned Fontana sisters, reflected the elegance and precision of Roman couture at its peak. Every detail was considered, every image carefully captured. The photographs that emerged from that day did not just document the event, they defined it. Within hours, they were being distributed across newspapers and magazines, turning the wedding into an international spectacle. At just 25 years old, Linda had reached a level of visibility that few could sustain. She was no longer simply an actress working within the industry. She had become a symbol of beauty, of glamour, of a certain post-war ideal that blended Hollywood ambition with European sophistication. After the wedding, the couple divided their time between the United States and Europe, though it was in Rome that something shifted for Linda. The city offered a different kind of life, one less rigidly tied to the structures of Hollywood. Here, social circles overlapped in ways that blurred the boundaries between film, politics, and aristocracy. Old families with centuries of history mingled with new wealth and international influence, creating a world that was both exclusive and fluid. Linda moved through it with ease. This was, in many ways, where her earlier life, her years of movement, her ability to adapt, fully revealed its value. She understood how to belong in different environments, how to navigate conversations, how to position herself without seeming to try. She became a familiar presence in Roman society, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who had been accepted into its inner circles. At the same time, her personal life began to take on new dimensions. She and Power started a family, welcoming two daughters, Rowena Power in 1951 and Tyrone Power in 1953. These were years that, from the outside, seemed to represent stability, a marriage that had captivated the world, a growing family, a life lived between continents in a kind of continuous motion. But beneath that surface, there were tensions that could not be ignored. Power, for all his public composure, was not a man entirely at ease within the confines of marriage. There had been patterns in his past, and those patterns did not simply disappear. Reports began to circulate, quiet at first, then more persistent, suggesting that his relationships outside the marriage were becoming difficult to ignore. For Linda, this created a situation that required strength rather than retreat. She was not someone who disappeared into the background. She did not respond to pressure by becoming smaller. Instead, she remained present, visible, continuing to move within the same social world that was now watching her more closely than ever. By the mid-1950s, the strain had become increasingly apparent. What had once been a celebrated union was now something more complicated, discussed in whispers and speculation. In both Hollywood and Rome, the reality of their situation was understood, even if it was not always openly acknowledged. Eventually, the separation came, and with it, the end of a marriage that had once seemed almost untouchable. The divorce was finalized in 1956. Linda retained custody of their daughters, and the life she had built with Power shifted into something else entirely, no longer defined by the partnership that had once placed her at the center of global attention. Power moved on, remarrying not long after. His life, like hers, continued to evolve in ways that were both public and private. But the chapter they had shared remained fixed in time, preserved in photographs and headlines, in the collective memory of a world that had watched it unfold. Then, just 2 years later, something happened that changed the shape of that memory forever. In 1958, while filming Solomon and Sheba in Madrid, Tyrone Power collapsed during a scene. He had suffered a heart attack. Despite efforts to save him, he died before reaching the hospital. He was 44 years old. The news spread quickly, carrying with it a kind of shock that accompanies sudden loss. For many, it was the loss of a star. For Linda, it was something more complex. They had been divorced for 2 years. Their lives had already moved in different directions. And yet, he remained the father of her children, a central figure in the most visible chapter of her life. Grief, in that sense, did not follow a simple path. But if the world expected her to withdraw, to disappear into that loss, it misunderstood her. Because what came next would take her deeper into a world far more unpredictable than anything she had known before. A world where glamour and danger existed side by side, and where the consequences would be far more difficult to escape. After the end of her marriage and the sudden death of Tyrone Power, the life of Linda Christian did not slow down. It shifted. The structure that had once defined her public image was gone, but in its place came something far less stable and far more unpredictable. By the late 1950s, she was fully embedded in a world that existed between wealth, power, and spectacle. This was not Hollywood in the traditional sense. It was something broader, an international circuit that moved through Rome, Paris, and the south of France. A world where aristocrats, diplomats, film stars, and industrial heirs crossed paths regularly, where reputation could be built overnight and undone just as quickly. It was in this environment that she met Porfirio Rubirosa. At the time, Rubirosa was already a legend of a certain kind. His name carried weight in gossip columns across continents. He had been married multiple times, to women of immense wealth and influence, and each relationship seemed to leave behind stories that only added to his reputation. He moved through life with a kind of reckless confidence, equally at home on polo fields, in diplomatic circles, or at late-night gatherings that blurred into early mornings. There was something about him that drew attention instantly. He understood how to occupy a room, how to make people feel seen, how to create the illusion of intimacy even in the most crowded settings. But beneath that charm was a volatility that many recognized and few avoided. When Linda entered his orbit, the connection was immediate. On the surface, it made sense. She belonged to that world as much as he did. She understood its rhythms, its expectations, its unspoken rules. But there was a difference between moving within that space and becoming entangled in it. And with Rubirosa, entanglement came quickly. Their relationship became public almost as soon as it began. They were seen together at events, photographed at races, mentioned in columns that tracked the movements of the international elite with obsessive detail. To outsiders, it looked like a continuation of the life Linda had already been living, glamorous, fast-moving, filled with access and attention. But this was something else. Rubirosa was not a man guided by caution. His life operated in extremes. Fast cars, high stakes, constant motion. He lived as though consequences were distant, something that belonged to another time or another person. And being close to him meant being pulled into that same current. Those who observed them together often described a kind of intensity that was difficult to ignore. Both of them were strong-willed, both accustomed to being the center of attention, both unwilling to yield easily. The result was a relationship that could shift rapidly, from excitement to tension, from closeness to distance. There were arguments, there were separations, and just as often, there were reconciliations that seemed to erase what had come before, at least temporarily. The press followed it all closely. Their names appeared together so frequently that the relationship began to take on a narrative of its own, one shaped as much by public perception as by private reality. Then, in 1959, something happened that brought that reality into sharper focus. Linda was involved in a serious car accident in Rome. The details were never fully made public, at least not in a way that offered a complete picture. But what was clear was that the accident was severe enough to require hospitalization and a long recovery. In the circles she moved in, the timing of the accident raised questions. It came during a period when her relationship with Rubirosa had reportedly reached a particularly difficult point. Some suggested a connection, others avoided speculation. What remained undeniable was the impact. For Linda, it was more than a physical event. It marked a moment where the life she had been living, the speed, the unpredictability, revealed its cost in a way that could not be ignored. And yet, even after that, the relationship did not end cleanly. They continued to circle each other, drawn back together despite the instability, until eventually the connection dissolved. Not with a clear conclusion, but with the kind of quiet separation that leaves more questions than answers. By the time it was truly over, Linda had already begun to move forward again. Rubirosa's life, however, continued on its own trajectory, unchanged, it seemed, by anything that had come before. Until, like so many moments in that world, it ended suddenly. In July 1965, in Paris, he crashed his car into a tree after a night of celebration. He died at the scene, and he was 56 years old. For Linda, the news would have carried a familiar weight. Another figure from her life, gone without warning. Another story that ended not with resolution, but with absence. But she did not retreat from the world she knew. Instead, she moved deeper into it. Because the next chapter of her life would take her into one of the oldest and most guarded social circles in Europe. A world defined not by fame or money alone, but by history, tradition, and expectations that ran deeper than either. And within that world, she would encounter a different kind of loss. By the early 1960s, Linda Christian had already lived several versions of a life most people could hardly imagine. She had moved from continents to capitals, from obscurity to global attention, from marriage to loss, and through relationships that had left their marks in ways both visible and hidden. But what came next was not a clean break from the past. It was, in many ways, a continuation, only quieter on the surface and more complicated underneath. It was during this period that she became involved with Edmund Purdom. Purdom's story, in its own way, mirrored parts of her own. He had experienced a sudden rise in Hollywood, stepping into major roles at a moment when opportunity seemed wide open. For a brief time, he had been positioned as a leading man, someone with the potential to sustain a long and visible career. But that momentum did not hold. The industry moved quickly, and by the late 1950s, the roles that had once seemed within reach began to disappear. Like Linda, he found himself working increasingly in Europe, films that kept him active, visible in certain circles, but far from the central spotlight of Hollywood. There was an understanding between them that did not require explanation. Both knew what it meant to come close to something lasting, and then to watch it slip just out of reach. At first, their relationship carried a sense of balance. They were often seen together in Rome, at gatherings and events that formed the rhythm of the social world they both inhabited. There was familiarity in it, a shared perspective that made things easier, at least on the surface. They were not outsiders trying to enter a world. They were already part of it. but familiarity does not guarantee stability. Over time, the relationship began to show signs of strain. Both carried histories that shaped how they moved through intimacy, expectations, disappointments, patterns that did not easily disappear. And when two people with that kind of past come together, the result is rarely simple. There were disagreements, some of them public, others confined to private spaces. The dynamic between them shifted, sometimes subtly, sometimes sharply. What had once seemed like understanding began to feel like tension. And then came an incident that, while not widely reported at the time, would later be referenced in accounts of her life. A confrontation between them reportedly turned physical. The details were never fully confirmed in public records, and those who spoke about it later often did so with caution. But the suggestion itself was enough to cast a different light on the relationship. It was no longer just complicated. It was potentially harmful. For Linda, this was not entirely unfamiliar territory. She had already lived through relationships that carried emotional intensity, unpredictability, and pressure. But this was different. This crossed a line that could not be easily explained away or ignored. Still, she did what she had always done. She moved forward. The relationship with Purdom eventually came to an end, not with a dramatic break, but with the kind of gradual separation that follows when two people reach a point where continuation is no longer possible. By then, whatever had drawn them together had been replaced by something heavier, something that could not sustain itself. What remained was not just the memory of the relationship, but what it represented within the larger pattern of her life. Because by this stage, a pattern had begun to emerge. She had reached the height of public attention early, in a moment that defined her in the eyes of the world. And in the years that followed, she found herself navigating relationships that were often intense, often unstable, and sometimes deeply difficult. Not because of a lack of strength, but because of the particular world she inhabited. A world that rewarded visibility, proximity to power, and the ability to remain present even when things became complicated. At the same time, her professional life continued, though in a quieter form. She took on roles in European productions, appearing in films that kept her connected to the industry, even if they did not bring the kind of recognition she had once sought. These were not the defining projects of a career. They were part of a different phase, one where presence mattered more than prominence. And outside of film, her real life continued to unfold in the spaces that had always shaped her: restaurants, villas, social gatherings that blurred the line between private and public. It was there that her name continued to carry weight, even as the nature of that recognition evolved. But something else was shifting as well. The world around her was changing. The era that had defined her rise, the post-war years of glamour, of tightly controlled studio systems, of carefully constructed public images, was beginning to fade. A new generation was emerging, new faces, new stories. The structures that had once elevated figures like her were no longer as stable as they had been. And within that shifting landscape, Linda found herself in a position that was difficult to define. She was too well known to disappear completely, too connected to be irrelevant, but no longer at the center of the narrative the way she once had been. For some, that might have meant stepping back. For her, it meant continuing, adapting once again to a world that was no longer the same as the one she had entered years before. And it was in that evolving world, in the early 1960s, that she encountered someone entirely different from the men who had come before. A man not defined by film or by reckless charm, but by something older. A name tied not to headlines, but to history. A connection that would draw her into one of the most traditional and guarded circles in Europe, and lead, ultimately, to one of the most devastating moments of her life. By the time Linda Christian entered the next chapter of her life, She was no longer chasing anything. Not fame, not validation, not even stability in the way she once had. What she carried instead was experience. Years of movement, relationships, public attention, and private consequences that had shaped how she saw the world. And yet, what came next would reach deeper than anything before. His name was Piero Aldobrandini. Unlike the men who had defined earlier chapters of her life, he did not belong to cinema or spectacle. He came from something older, one of the most established aristocratic families in Italy. The Aldobrandini name had existed for centuries, tied to the fabric of Roman history, connected to power structures that predated modern politics and outlasted entire eras. By the 1960s, that kind of nobility no longer held political authority in the way it once had. But its social weight remained undeniable. It carried expectations, traditions, and an unspoken understanding of how life should be lived, particularly within its own circles. For Linda, this was a different world entirely. She had moved through elite spaces before, had built connections across Europe, had been welcomed into rooms that most people would never see. But this was not about access. It was about belonging to a structure that had its own rules, its own boundaries, and its own quiet resistance to change. And yet, the relationship began. There was an intensity to it that people noticed almost immediately, not the volatile kind that had defined her earlier experiences, but something steadier, something that, at least from the outside, appeared grounded. They spent time together in Rome, a city that by now had become more than just a place for Linda. It was where she had lived, loved, and built a life that stretched across decades. In many ways, Rome felt like home. And with Piero, there was a sense, however fragile, that she had found something closer to stability than she had known in years. But stability, in that world, was never entirely within the control of the people living inside it. Aristocratic families carried expectations that extended beyond personal choice. There were traditions to maintain, reputations to protect, and a quiet but persistent pressure to remain within defined boundaries. For a woman like Linda, foreign-born, divorced, an actress whose life had been lived publicly, those boundaries were not easily crossed. The relationship existed within that tension. There were questions that did not always have clear answers, conversations that extended beyond the two of them, a sense that what they were building was not entirely theirs to shape. Still, they continued. For a time, it seemed enough. And then, without warning, it ended. In 1968, Piero Aldobrandini was killed in a skiing accident in the Alps. He was young, still in his mid-30s, and the suddenness of it left no space for preparation. Had no gradual understanding, no opportunity to make sense of what had happened. One moment, he existed within her life. The next, he was gone. There are losses that arrive with explanation, with context, with time to process what is happening. And then there are losses like this, abrupt, final, and impossible to reshape into something manageable. For Linda, this was different from anything she had experienced before. The end of her marriage had been painful, but it had unfolded over time. The death of Tyrone Power had been sudden, but by then their lives had already diverged. Even the chaos of her relationship with Porfirio Rubirosa had carried its own kind of emotional distance by the time it ended. This was not like that. This was immediate, personal, deep. People who knew her during that period would later describe a grief that was not performed for the public, not shaped for headlines. It was quiet, internal, and lasting. The kind of grief that changes how a person carries themselves, even when they say nothing about it. By this point, Linda was in her mid-40s. Her daughters were growing, her life was still full in many ways, And yet something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The world around her was changing as well. The Rome she had entered in the late 1940s, the city of the La Dolce Vita era, of endless nights and flashing cameras, was beginning to fade. The energy that had once defined it was giving way to something quieter, less defined by spectacle. The people who had filled those years were aging, leaving, or simply moving on. And she remained. She stayed in Rome, continued to live within the world she knew, but with a different presence. The brightness that had once defined her public image had softened, not disappeared, but changed, shaped by everything she had lived through. In the years that followed, she began to step further away from the kind of life that had once kept her constantly in motion. She continued to work occasionally, taking roles that kept her connected to the industry, but without the urgency that had once driven her. More importantly, she turned her attention towards something more personal, her own story. By the 1970s, she had begun writing her memoir, a project that would take years to complete. When it was eventually published in 1986 under the title Linda, My Own Story, it offered a version of her life told on her own terms. Not a complete unveiling, there were parts she chose not to fully explore, but enough to reveal the voice behind the image. A voice that was thoughtful, observant, and at times quietly marked by sadness. Because by then she understood something clearly, that the life she had lived could not be reduced to its most visible moments, the wedding, the headlines, the names she had been linked to. Those were only fragments. What defined it were the experiences in between, the movement, the reinvention, the losses that arrived without warning, and the fact that she had continued, even when continuing was not easy.